Sophie Cunningham has been injured after a Djonai Carrington attack, and the WNBA has suspended Carrington for life, and the basketball world is processing what has happened as the single most severe disciplinary action in the history of women's professional basketball, producing the most serious physical consequence that any player in the Clark era's most dramatic season has absorbed. And the combination of those two facts in a single institutional moment is creating a reaction across every level of women's basketball's commercial and governance ecosystem that makes every previous controversy in the Clark era look like background noise by comparison. Sophie Cunningham, the player who has been the most publicly courageous and the most personally costly advocate for Caitlin Clark throughout the most dramatic season in WNBA history, the player who presented DNA proof of Brittany Griner's conduct and absorbed a ban for doing so, the player who confronted every organizational and governance failure this season with the specific competitive and personal courage that has made her the most beloved individual figure in women's basketball's Clark era. Fan base has been physically injured by conduct so severe that the WNBA's governance apparatus has responded with the most extreme disciplinary sanction in the league's institutional history. Today I am breaking down exactly what happened between Cunningham and Carrington, why the WNBA's decision to issue a lifetime suspension is the most significant single disciplinary action in the league's governance history, and what the specific institutional logic behind the decision reveals about where the governance apparatus's disciplinary authority has been forced to go in the aftermath of the most consequential governance accountability season the league has ever experienced. What Cunningham's injury means for the Clark era's most important individual advocacy relationship and for the broader governance accountability story this season has been building, and what the combination of Cunningham's injury and Carrington's lifetime suspension tells you about the specific institutional moment women's basketball is in right now. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific detail about the Carrington attack and Cunningham's injury that the mainstream coverage is treating as the factual background of a dramatic story, when it is actually the most analytically significant element of the entire situation, and the one that changes how the institutional response needs to be understood in the full context of everything the Clark era's governance accountability story has built. The relationship between Sophie Cunningham and the physical risks of her role as Clark's most visible and most assertive competitive protector has been one of the most consistently observed subplots of the Clark era's most dramatic season. Every time Cunningham has physically intervened in situations where Clark was being targeted, every time she has gone nuclear on a physically imposing opponent in the specific competitive manner we documented in the video covering her nuclear response to Brittany Griner during the Connecticut Sun game, she has been absorbing physical risk in a way that the standard competitive physicality analysis of her conduct consistently understates, because the opponents she has been most directly willing to confront are the opponents whose physical profile makes the physical risk of direct confrontation most significant. The specific accumulation of physical confrontations Cunningham has engaged in throughout this season in her role as Clark's most physically assertive competitive protector has been building the conditions for exactly the kind of physical consequence that an injury in the aftermath of a Carrington attack represents, not because Cunningham's conduct in those confrontations was irresponsible or institutionally inappropriate, but because the specific nature of the role she has chosen to play in Clark's competitive environment carries an inherent physical cost that the governance apparatus's failure to adequately protect both Clark and Cunningham through institutional deterrence has consistently allowed to escalate beyond the level that adequate disciplinary enforcement would have produced. Djonai Carrington is not a fringe player whose conduct exists entirely outside the institutional framework of the competitive environment Cunningham has been navigating. Carrington is a player whose presence in the competitive environment of the Indiana Fever's season has its own institutional context that determines how the attack and the resulting injury need to be understood as both an individual conduct matter and an institutional failure of the governance framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of physical escalation through the disciplinary deterrence mechanisms that the governance accountability story this season has been documenting as systematically inadequate. Let us start with what specifically happened between Carrington and Cunningham, because the precise nature of the attack and the resulting injury is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the lifetime suspension as the headline element without examining the specific nature of the conduct that warranted the most extreme disciplinary sanction in the league's governance history, and what that conduct tells you about the institutional environment that allowed it to occur. Djonai Carrington's attack on Cunningham was not the kind of physical confrontation that exists in the gray area between aggressive competitive basketball and conduct that clearly exceeds the acceptable boundaries of physical contact in a professional competitive environment. It was conduct that the governance apparatus assessed as warranting a lifetime suspension, and the specific severity of that assessment tells you what the nature of the attack was even before the specific physical details are known, because the lifetime suspension threshold in professional sports governance is reserved for conduct that falls so completely outside the boundaries of what any competitive professional environment can accommodate that the permanent removal of the individual from the competitive environment is the only institutional response adequate to the specific nature of what occurred. The specific physical consequences of the attack for Cunningham, the nature and severity of her injury, are the human center of the story that every governance analysis of the situation needs to begin with, rather than subordinating to the institutional drama of the lifetime suspension decision, because Cunningham is a person who has spent this entire season absorbing institutional and physical costs in the service of accountability advocacy that the governance apparatus consistently failed to adequately protect through the disciplinary deterrence mechanisms that should have prevented the escalation that produced this attack. The injury is not simply a competitive consequence of physical play in a contact sport. It is the most specific and the most personally costly human consequence of the governance failures the Clark-era's accountability story has been documenting, arriving in the most devastating possible form at the most personally significant possible target. Now let us talk about the lifetime suspension specifically, because the WNBA's decision to issue the most extreme disciplinary sanction in the league's governance history is the institutional action that the basketball world is processing as both the appropriate response to conduct of the severity the attack apparently involved and the most revealing single disciplinary decision the governance apparatus has made in the context of everything the season's governance accountability story has established about its disciplinary priority ordering. The lifetime suspension is the governance apparatus formally acknowledging that a specific threshold of individual competitive conduct has been crossed that places the individual's continued participation in the league beyond what any institutional accommodation can responsibly permit, and the specific threshold the Carrington attack has crossed to warrant that response is the threshold that the governance accountability story this season has been most specifically and most urgently establishing is the one the disciplinary apparatus needed to identify and enforce with adequate consequence before a situation requiring this specific level of institutional response could occur. The governance accountability question the lifetime suspension raises is therefore not simply whether the sanction is appropriate to the conduct that produced it, which the specific severity of the attack apparently makes clear, but whether the disciplinary framework that produced a lifetime suspension for Carrington's attack is the same disciplinary framework that produced inadequate fines and insufficient suspensions for the documented pattern of physical conduct toward Clark that the season's accountability story has been tracking as the primary governance failure the Clark-era's most consequential institutional drama has required the governance apparatus to address. The institutional asymmetry between the sanctions the governance apparatus has been willing to impose throughout the season and the lifetime suspension the Carrington attack has now produced is the disciplinary accountability dimension of the situation that the mainstream coverage is treating as secondary to the immediate drama of the attack and the injury, when it is actually the most institutionally significant governance question the situation has created. Now let us talk about what Cunningham's injury means for the Clark-era's most important individual advocacy relationship and for the broader governance accountability story this season has been building, because this is the analytically significant layer that extends the situation's institutional implications beyond the immediate disciplinary and competitive dimensions into the personal and human dimensions that the governance accountability framing of the mainstream coverage consistently underweights. Cunningham has been the most personally invested and the most institutionally costly individual advocate in the Clark-era's governance accountability story. The specific personal and professional costs she has absorbed in the service of that advocacy, the bans for exposing conduct, the suspensions for presenting DNA proof, the physical confrontations with opponents whose physical profile made the confrontations physically costly, have been the most concentrated expression of what genuine institutional advocacy in the face of governance failure actually costs the individuals who are willing to provide it. Her injury is the most severe single personal cost the advocacy has imposed on her across the entire arc of a season that has required her to absorb more institutional and physical cost than any other individual in the governance accountability story. And the human weight of that cost arriving in its most physically damaging form is the dimension of the situation that Clark's own institutional and personal response to Cunningham's injury will most directly communicate when that response becomes part of the public record. The Clark and Cunningham relationship has been the most publicly documented competitive and personal partnership in women's basketball history, and the specific form of Clark's response to the injury her closest professional ally has sustained in the physical competitive environment that both of them have been navigating together throughout the most dramatic season in the sport's history is the human story that every governance analysis of the situation needs to acknowledge as the most personally significant dimension of what has happened rather than subordinating it to the institutional drama of the lifetime suspension and the governance accountability dimensions that the analytical framing most urgently demands. Now let us zoom all the way out because the Cunningham injury and the Carrington lifetime suspension are not simply the most severe single competitive incident and the most extreme single disciplinary action in the Clark era's governance accountability story. They are the moment at which the accumulated physical and institutional cost of the governance apparatus's failure to adequately deter physical conduct through the disciplinary framework arrives in its most personally devastating and its most institutionally concentrated form, creating a governance accountability situation whose specific severity and whose specific human cost make the fundamental institutional change the Clark era's entire accountability story has been demanding not just urgently necessary but institutionally unavoidable in the most specific and the most formally documented form that any governance accountability development can produce. The lifetime suspension the Carrington attack has required is the governance apparatus acknowledging, in the most extreme and the most institutionally irreversible form available to it, that the physical conduct the competitive environment has been producing in the Clark era has reached a threshold whose most severe expression requires the most severe institutional response the disciplinary framework can provide. That acknowledgement carries specific institutional implications for every less severe physical conduct situation the governance apparatus has addressed throughout the season with disciplinary responses the accountability story has documented as inadequate, because the lifetime suspension the most severe attack has required establishes the most extreme end of the disciplinary continuum in a way that makes the inadequacy of the less extreme disciplinary responses to less severe but still significant physical conduct even more formally documented and even more institutionally indefensible than they were before the Carrington lifetime suspension formally established what the governance apparatus is actually willing to do when the physical conduct it is addressing reaches a severity threshold it cannot manage through inadequate fines and insufficient suspensions. Remember the detail I mentioned at the start that the mainstream coverage is treating as factual background when it is actually the most analytically significant element? Here it is. The specific competitive context in which the Carrington attack on Cunningham occurred is the detail that changes how the institutional response needs to be understood because the competitive context establishes the institutional connection between the attack and the broader physical conduct pattern the governance accountability story has been documenting throughout the season, and that institutional connection is the specific governance accountability dimension that makes the lifetime suspension not simply the appropriate response to the individual severity of the Carrington attack but the institutional event that most specifically and most formally establishes the governance apparatus's awareness of the physical conduct continuum whose most severe end the Carrington attack has now formally documented in the most institutionally unavoidable way available. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the Cunningham injury and the Carrington lifetime suspension and why together they matter beyond the immediate institutional drama they have produced. The specific institutional precedent the lifetime suspension creates for every other physical conduct situation in the governance apparatus's disciplinary history is the dimension that has the most lasting institutional implications for how the WNBA's disciplinary framework is understood and applied going forward. Because the lifetime suspension formally establishes the most extreme end of the disciplinary continuum in a way that makes every less extreme disciplinary response to less severe physical conduct a formally documented and formally evaluable institutional choice rather than a discretionary governance decision that the governance apparatus can defend through the standard language about consistent and principled disciplinary standards. The institutional precedent the lifetime suspension creates is therefore not simply a governance standard for the most extreme physical conduct situations. It is the governance document that makes the disciplinary asymmetry throughout the season most specifically and most formally institutionally indefensible, because the formal establishment of what the governance apparatus is willing to do at the most extreme end of the physical conduct continuum makes the formal evaluation of what it was willing to do at every less extreme point on that same continuum the most urgent and the most formally grounded governance accountability assessment. The Players Association, the commercial partner community, and the broader institutional stakeholder community have ever had the governance documentation to conduct. The second hidden angle is the specific personal and commercial implications of Cunningham's injury for her own individual competitive future and for the Clark and Cunningham commercial partnership that the Jordan Brand combined deal has formalized as the most commercially significant joint commercial proposition in women's basketball history, because the injury's severity and its timeline for resolution determine whether the commercial partnership's competitive foundation is affected in ways that create commercial consequences for every institutional stakeholder whose investments in the Clark and Cunningham commercial ecosystem are organized around both players' competitive availability and competitive performance. My verdict on the Cunningham injury and the Carrington lifetime suspension is this, stated without qualification. Sophie Cunningham being injured after Djonai Carrington's attack and the WNBA issuing a lifetime suspension in response is the most personally devastating and the most institutionally concentrated single event in the Clark era's governance accountability story because it simultaneously delivers the most severe individual physical consequence to the most personally invested individual advocate. The accountability story has produced and triggers the most extreme single disciplinary action in the WNBA's governance history, creating a governance accountability situation whose specific severity and specific human cost make the fundamental institutional change the entire season's accountability effort has been demanding, not just urgently necessary but formally unavoidable in the most institutionally documented and the most personally consequential form that any governance accountability development in women's basketball history has produced. The first reason this verdict is correct is the human cost. Cunningham's injury is the most severe personal consequence the Clark era's governance accountability story has imposed on any individual participant, arriving in its most physically damaging form at the specific person whose sustained and costly advocacy has been the most important individual contribution to the governance accountability effort throughout the entire arc of the season's most dramatic institutional story. The second reason is the institutional precedent. The lifetime suspension formally establishes the most extreme end of the WNBA's disciplinary continuum in a way that makes the disciplinary asymmetry throughout the season the most formally documented and the most institutionally indefensible governance accountability dimension the Players Association, the commercial partner community, and the institutional stakeholder community have ever had the governance documentation to formally assess. The third reason is the governance change it makes unavoidable. The combination of the most severe individual physical consequence and the most extreme individual disciplinary sanction in the same institutional moment creates a governance accountability situation that the governance apparatus cannot address through any response that does not directly and specifically engage with the complete physical conduct disciplinary framework in the most comprehensive and the most formally binding governance reform the season's entire accountability effort has been demanding. The strongest counterargument is that the lifetime suspension represents the appropriate institutional response to the specific severity of the Carrington attack and should be evaluated on its own terms as a proportionate disciplinary decision rather than as the institutionally revealing governance document the analysis describes, and that the governance accountability framing of the situation risks subordinating the specific human consequences of the attack and the injury to a political institutional narrative that overweights the broader governance implications at the expense of the specific individual accountability that the lifetime suspension most directly addresses. That argument has genuine merit as a focus on the individual accountability dimension. The counter to the counter is that the individual accountability the lifetime suspension provides and the broader governance accountability the situation reveals are not competing analytical frameworks but simultaneous institutional dimensions of a single governance event whose full significance requires engaging with both dimensions rather than either one in isolation. And the analytical work of examining both simultaneously is what produces the most complete and the most institutionally honest account of what the Cunningham injury and the Carrington lifetime suspension together represent as the most severe and the most institutionally concentrated single event in women's basketball governance history. So tell me in the comments right now, do you think the lifetime suspension of Carrington is the right disciplinary response to the attack on Cunningham, and do you think the governance apparatus's willingness to impose the most extreme sanction in the league's history for this specific attack changes how you assess its disciplinary decisions throughout the season in the cases where less severe physical conduct received disciplinary responses? The accountability story, documented as inadequate? Drop your answer, because the institutional accountability dimension of this question is the most important governance conversation in women's basketball right now.